Star Wars loves beginnings. It loves ignition. It loves the moment when a young character looks out at a horizon and feels destiny pulling them forward. But it has always struggled with what happens after that destiny is fulfilled. Because once the war is won and the hero survives long enough to age, the saga quietly reframes that survival as a problem rather than an achievement, turning time itself into a kind of narrative accusation that demands justification rather than reflection. When heroes grow older in Star Wars, they are almost never allowed to evolve into elders who still matter within the living story. Instead, aging is framed as retreat, as withdrawal from relevance, as if stepping back from constant conflict is not a natural evolution, but a moral failure, and the language of the narrative makes this clear by associating age with exile, isolation, or removal from consequence rather than earned rest or stewardship. These characters do not transition into mentors who shape the future through guidance and continuity. They are instead placed on shelves until the galaxy breaks badly enough to drag them back in. And even then, their return is framed less as wisdom re-entering the world, and more as unfinished business, clawing its way back to the surface, as though time itself has been keeping score against them. Obi-Wan Kenobi is the clearest early example of this pattern, because his aging's not treated as the hard-won result of endurance, restraint, and long-term moral clarity. It is treated as stagnation, as a man frozen in amber while the galaxy rots around him, watching rather than acting, even though watching is precisely what survival required after the fall of the Jedi. The story does not reward Obi-Wan for patience, for resisting the urge to become a crusader in a galaxy no longer ready for him. It quietly indicts him for not fixing things sooner, for not intervening more aggressively, as if the mere passage of time under suffering automatically equates to moral inadequacy. And this framing turns survival itself into a kind of guilt. Luke Skywalker inherits this treatment in a far more explicit and painful way, because his older self is not allowed to be cautious, reflective, or restrained without those traits being immediately reinterpreted as cowardice, bitterness, or collapse. Reflection becomes paralysis, wisdom becomes shame, and the emotional distance that often follows trauma is framed not as healing, but as betrayal. Rather than showing a hero who learned from failure and adjusted his approach to power and responsibility, the narrative rewrites maturity as fear, positioning Luke's hesitation as proof that he has lost faith rather than gained perspective. And this reframing is essential to the franchise's logic, because a Luke who grows thoughtfully would destabilize the perpetual cycle of collapse and rebellion that Star Wars depends on. Han Solo fares no better, because he is never truly allowed to age forward at all. When he reappears later in life, he is emotionally reset to an earlier version of himself, repeating the same avoidance, the same immaturity, the same flight from responsibility. Not because it makes sense for the character, but because growth interferes with nostalgia, and nostalgia is easier to sell when characters remain frozen in familiar patterns. The alternative, portraying Han as someone who learned how to build stability, maintain relationships, and adapt to peace, is quietly avoided because stability reads as boring within Star Wars emotional grammar, and boring is treated as a greater sin than regression. So growth is erased rather than explored, and the character is punished for the years he survived. Across the saga, legacy characters are only allowed to re-enter the narrative. Once they are broken, defeated, or estranged, their pain becomes narrative currency, something to be interrogated rather than their endurance being celebrated, and the story treats their imperfections not as human texture, but as evidence against them, as though aging itself must be justified through suffering. What emerges is a consistent pattern, where older heroes are not valued for continuity, memory, or perspective. They are summoned back only to answer for failure, and the longer they live, the heavier that burden becomes, because the franchise rarely asks what it means to sustain peace, only how it feels to lose it again. This is not accidental. It flows from how Star Wars defines hope itself, because hope in this universe is equated with momentum, with rebellion, with forward motion, and dramatic rupture. And aging heroes slow that momentum by necessity. They hesitate, they weigh consequences, they remember what victory actually costs. And within the saga's emotional logic, that hesitation reads as anti-hope. Rather than redefining hope as the ability to maintain peace, Star Wars clings to hope as overthrow, as constant motion against an enemy. Which means that any character who embodies caution threatens the core rhythm of the myth. And instead of evolving that myth to accommodate maturity, the franchise sidelines maturity to preserve simplicity. Mature characters complicate myths. They do not leap, they ask questions, they remember, and those traits are poison to a structure built on clean arcs and decisive action. So rather than allowing the myth to age alongside its heroes, Star Wars repeatedly resets the board, turning wisdom into obstruction and patience into guilt. This first half of the pattern reveals a franchise that is deeply uncomfortable with what survival looks like after heroism. Because to admit that growth is possible would mean admitting that failure is survivable, that mistakes do not have to define a person forever, and that idea threatens the tragic weight Star Wars has relied on for decades. And once that fear sets in, the story begins to treat peace, stability, and graceful aging not as achievements but as narrative threats that must be undermined, which leads directly into why the saga keeps breaking its heroes instead of letting them finish their journeys with dignity. Once you recognize how consistently Star Wars frames aging as a problem to be solved, rather than a phase to be honored, the underlying logic becomes impossible to unsee, because the franchise does not merely struggle with older heroes, it structurally resists what maturity represents, and that resistance shapes nearly every creative decision made once a character survives long enough to outgrow the myth that created them. At its core, Star Wars confuses hope with youth, not philosophically, but emotionally, because hope in this saga is coded as acceleration, as motion, as the rush of rebellion, and the electricity of defiance, and youth embodies that energy naturally, while age tempers it, slows it, questions it, and hesitation reads as weakness in a story language that equates righteousness with forward momentum. An aging hero does not charge, they assess, they remember what breaking the galaxy actually costs, and that memory introduces friction into a narrative engine designed to run hot and fast. So instead of redefining hope as the work of sustaining peace, repairing systems, and preventing collapse, Star Wars repeatedly reverts to hope as overthrow, because overthrow produces spectacle, and maturity produces maintenance. Maintenance is invisible. It does not explode. It does not rally crowds, and it does not sell urgency. So the story reframes hesitation as fear, caution as failure, and restraint as betrayal, because those reframings clear the board for another cycle of rebellion without requiring the myth itself to grow up. This leads directly into the franchise's deeper discomfort with maturity, because maturity threatens the mythic structure Star Wars is built on. Myths thrive on clarity, decisive action, and symbolic gestures that resolve conflict in emotionally legible ways. But mature characters complicate those beats. They ask whether the fight is necessary, whether the cost is justified, and whether victory will actually solve anything. Those questions are not wrong, but they are disruptive, because once a character starts asking them, the myth must either evolve or break, and Star Wars has consistently chosen to break the character, instead, isolating them, discrediting them, or reframing their insight as despair so the larger structure can remain intact. Allowing heroes to age gracefully would force the saga to admit that growth is possible, that mistakes do not permanently define a person, and that failure can be integrated rather than mythologized. But Star Wars depends heavily on failure as a source of tragedy and emotional propulsion, and tragedy loses power if it can be healed without collapse. If Obi-Wan's restraint were framed as wisdom rather than guilt, the fall of the Republic would look less like an eternal wound and more like a chapter that informed better stewardship. If Luke's caution were framed as hard-earned perspective rather than cowardice, the galaxy's repeated implosions would feel less inevitable, and inevitability is a cornerstone of the saga's tragic tone. By insisting that failure must scar identity permanently, Star Wars preserves the emotional gravity of its past, but at the cost of its future, because characters are not allowed to metabolize their trauma into something functional. They are allowed only to be defined by it, and aging becomes proof not of endurance, but of unresolved sin. This is why the franchise fears peace more than conflict, because peace requires explanation. It requires systems, compromise, vigilance, and humility. And an older hero maintaining stability would logically prevent the galaxy from falling apart again. which would erase the justification for another apocalyptic reset. A stable Luke is narratively dangerous because a Luke who learned how power corrupts would not allow another authoritarian regime to rise unchecked. A Luke who integrated his failures would intervene earlier, mentor differently, and distribute responsibility rather than centralizing it. And that version of the character would close off entire avenues of conflict the franchise relies on. So peace must be reframed as fragile, temporary, or illusory, and maturity must be reframed as decay, because only through decay can the galaxy justify tearing itself apart again, and only through tearing itself apart can Star Wars return to the emotional register it knows how to play. This culminates in the franchise's most revealing limitation, its inability to write endings. Only resets because true growth implies closure, and closure implies that something is finished, that an arc has resolved, and that the story must now continue without leaning on the same emotional scaffolding. Aging gracefully would mean letting characters complete their journeys, not by dying violently or collapsing morally, but by transitioning into roles that no longer center them as engines of conflict. And Star Wars resists that transition because it depends on perpetual relevance, not earned finality. So instead of allowing heroes to conclude, the saga undoes them, it kills them, isolates them, or breaks them down to justify one last return, because an unfinished hero can always be pulled back into the narrative, while a completed one demands something new. This is why legacy characters are so often summoned back only after they have failed again, because failure reopens the arc, it reintroduces tension, and it allows the story to mine nostalgia without confronting the uncomfortable question of what comes after victory. In this light, Star Wars' treatment of aging heroes is not cynical, it is anxious. Anxious about growth, anxious about peace, and anxious about letting go of the mythic clarity that made it powerful in the first place. And so it punishes maturity not out of malice, but out of fear that evolution will dilute identity. But the irony is that this fear slowly erodes the very hope the saga claims to protect, because when heroes are not allowed to age with dignity, the future stops feeling aspirational. It starts feeling like a loop, a cycle of collapse where every victory is temporary and every lesson is forgotten. Hope stripped of continuity becomes exhaustion, and rebellion without resolution becomes ritual, and the galaxy begins to feel less like a place worth saving, and more like a machine that consumes its heroes to stay alive. Star Wars does not fail because its heroes grow old. It fails when it treats aging as evidence that heroism itself was a mistake, because the most radical idea the saga has never fully embraced is not balance or destiny, but stewardship, the quiet, unglamorous work of carrying something forward without needing to burn it down again. Until Star Wars learns how to let its heroes finish their journeys, maturity will continue to be framed as failure, peace as weakness, and age as a narrative liability, not because those ideas are true, but because the myth has not yet learned how to grow old alongside the people who believed in it first. Thanks for watching. If you like my content, be sure to check out my third channel, Critical Analysis Hub Art. I will be posting art that I have made like scratch art and posting on there. Also be sure to follow my Facebook page and the TikTok. I am thankful for all the support that everyone has given me the past year and look forward to the success that we will have in the future.